Little Richard arrived at the ABC television studio with exactly one condition. He did not call it a condition. He called it how things were going to be. He had been calling things how things were going to be since 1955, which was a long time to be right about it. And the consistency of the record had not reduced his certainty. If anything, the consistency of the record had made the certainty quieter, not less present, but more settled. The settled certainty of someone who has demonstrated the same thing so many times that demonstration is no longer required. He knew what he was. He had always known. The industry had taken longer to understand it, which was the industry's characteristic relationship to things that were ahead of their categorization. And by 1969, the industry's understanding had caught up to the point where it booked him on major television programs. But the industry's current understanding of him was the industry's problem, not his. He was exactly what he had always been. The television program would accommodate itself to that, or it would not have him. He did not call it a condition. He called it how things were going to be. The distinction mattered to him. A condition implies negotiation, implies a starting position from which compromise is possible, implies that the other party has a counteroffer available. Little Richard did not operate in that register. He operated in the register of fact. This was how things were going to be. The producers could arrange themselves around that fact, or they could find someone else for the time slot. The producers, who had invested significantly in the booking and who knew that the time slot was not going to be filled by someone of equivalent magnitude on short notice, arranged themselves around the fact. What Little Richard had decided, the fact that the producers were now arranging themselves around, was that the performance segment was going to be longer than the show's format specified. It was going to be longer because the music required it to be longer, and what the music required was not subject to revision by the show's format. The show's format existed to present the music. If the format was insufficient to contain the music, the format was the problem, not the music. This was self-evident to Little Richard. He was not certain it was equally self-evident to the production staff, which was why he had stated it before anyone had the opportunity to assume otherwise. Tutti Frutti in 1955 had not been a novelty. Long Tall Sally had not been a novelty. Good Golly Miss Molly had not been a novelty. These were not one-season phenomena. They were recordings that had entered the bloodstream of popular music and that had continued to circulate there, influencing everything that came after them, shaping the understanding of what a rock and roll voice could do, what a rock and roll performance required, what the relationship between a performer and an audience could be when the performer decided to bring everything available to the encounter. The Beatles had covered Little Richard. The Rolling Stones had covered Little Richard. James Brown had acknowledged him. The musicians who had built the 1960s on the foundations he had laid were numerous and included most of the significant figures of the decade. Little Richard had not been fully credited for this in his lifetime, which was a specific failure of the music industry's historical accounting, and not a failure of his actual contribution. By 1969, he was also a man in the middle of one of the more complicated reinventions of a career that had seen several. He was 37 years old, which meant he had been performing professionally for nearly 20 years, which meant he had accumulated the specific confidence, not the performed confidence of someone who needs the room to believe in them, but the settled confidence of someone who has spent 20 years discovering that the rooms always end up believing in them, because the performance always delivers what it promises. He had never failed to deliver what he promised. The promises had been large. He had delivered them anyway, consistently, across 2 decades of rooms that ranged from small venues in the American South to international concert halls, because the thing he had inside him was not dependent on the size of the room. It was the same thing regardless. The gospel period of the late 1950s and early 1960s, when he had left rock and roll for religious music, had been real. Not a marketing move, but a genuine turn of the person toward something he believed. The return to secular music had been equally real, not a capitulation, but a recognition that what he was constituted as a performer was not something he could step away from permanently. He had come back to rock and roll because rock and roll was where he lived. He arrived at the studio with his condition, and the producers adjusted, and the cameras were eventually prepared to run for the longer duration he required, and the stage was set, and Little Richard walked out onto it. Tom Jones watched him walk to the stage with a specific quality of observation he reserved for things he needed to understand. The close, steady attention of a man who was not simply watching the booking he had made arrive, but was watching someone he had been paying attention to for 20 years move toward a piano. Little Richard moved through the studio the way he moved through everything, with an energy that was not performed, that was simply the natural state of a person operating at that level of engagement with the world. The studio responded. The musicians adjusted their instruments. The floor manager stepped back. The room was already configuring itself around what was about to happen before Little Richard had played a single note. Tom Jones had been briefed. He had been told by his producers that the day was going to require a specific kind of management. He had been told this with the particular tone of voice that production teams use when they mean, "We have booked something we are not entirely in control of, and we need you to be the thing that keeps the evening from becoming an event rather than a program." Tom Jones had listened to this briefing with the patience he usually brought to these conversations, and had thought, with something that was not quite amusement but was in that neighborhood, that this was not a problem. This was, in fact, the whole point. The show had been built around exactly this kind of situation, around the moments when the music was too large for the format, and the format had to accommodate itself to the music rather than the other way around. He had not built the program to produce 45 minutes of scheduled entertainment. He had built it to put genuine performers on a stage and let them do what genuine performers do, which was unpredictable and unrepeatable and could not be produced on a schedule. The producers, whose job required them to think about formats and schedules and running times, were experiencing the situation as a management problem. Tom Jones, whose job required him to think about music, was experiencing it as a confirmation that the booking had been correct. Little Richard had arrived with a condition. The condition was that the music would not be contained by the format. This was not a problem. This was the whole reason the booking existed. That what they were describing was not a crisis to be managed, but an opportunity to receive. Little Richard was not an inconvenience in a television studio. Little Richard was one of the people without whom Tom Jones would not have known, at the age of 17 in the working men's clubs of Pontypridd, what he was supposed to be doing with his voice. The debt was real. The occasion of being in the same room as the person to whom the debt was owed was not an occasion for crisis management. It was an occasion for paying attention. Little Richard, in 1969, was 37 years old. He had been in popular music since the early 1950s, when he had arrived in the industry with a quality of energy and a specific visual and sonic presence that the industry had not encountered before, and that it processed, initially, as a novelty, as something too extreme to be sustainable, too excessive to last, too far outside the range of what popular music was understood to be able to accommodate to be taken seriously as an artistic proposition. The industry had been wrong, not slightly wrong, not wrong in a way that required generous reinterpretation to understand as wrongness, but comprehensively, fundamentally wrong, in the specific way that the industry tended to be wrong about the things that were actually changing the music rather than simply extending what the music already was. What happened when Little Richard performed on a stage was one of the most documented phenomena in the history of rock and roll, which meant it was one of the most described and one of the least adequately described. Because adequate description of something that functions primarily as a physical experience in a room requires tools that language only approximates. He was total. That was as close as language came. The performance was total in the sense that everything that could be used was being used. The voice, the body, the piano, if there was a piano, the interaction with the audience, the interaction with the band, the sheer physical energy of a performer who had decided at some point early in his career that partial commitment was not commitment at all. Tom Jones watched from the side of the stage. He watched with the specific quality of someone watching something they recognize, not something familiar, but something that speaks directly to the thing that the watcher has always understood about what a performance requires, and that it is rare to see demonstrated at this level by someone else. The format of the program was extended. The floor manager's schedule was set aside. The cameras stayed running. Little Richard performed for as long as the music required. When it was over, when Little Richard had given the performance everything it asked for and had received from the room everything the room could give, Tom Jones walked back out onto the stage. He did not say anything in particular about what had just happened. He did not reach for a statement equal to the performance. He simply stood next to Little Richard and let the room hold what was in it. That was the right decision. It was the only correct decision available. Some things require commentary, and some things require silence. And Tom Jones, who had been learning to read rooms since he was 17 years old in South Wales, knew which he was standing in. He said nothing. Little Richard, for once, did not say anything either. The room held. The music had done what music does when the person performing it decides to bring everything available to the encounter. The format had not survived. The music had. This was, for Tom Jones, the ideal outcome. The thing that This Is Tom Jones had been designed, in its best version of itself, to produce. Not a successful 45 minutes of scheduled entertainment. Not a smooth broadcast that confirmed the existing order of things and returned the audience to their evenings without disturbing anything. Something that did not fit neatly into what the audience had been expecting, and that they received, in consequence, more fully than things that fit. Little Richard had brought his condition. The producers had adjusted. The cameras had run longer than the schedule specified. The music had been what the music required being. And Tom Jones, standing at the side of the stage while Little Richard performed, had watched the whole thing with the attention of someone witnessing the full version of the thing he had been drawn to since he was a teenager in South Wales, hearing those records for the first time and understanding, without being able to articulate it, that this was what a performance was supposed to be. He had not articulated it then. He did not need to articulate it in the television studio in 1969. He had simply stood there, watching, understanding, carrying the specific gratitude of someone who has been allowed, on a particular evening, to be in the room when the source of something important is demonstrating itself at full capacity. The debt he had carried since those teenage years in Pontypridd, the debt to the voice and the piano and the complete and unrepeatable commitment that had told him what his own voice was for had been, in that room, in some partial and impermanent way, acknowledged. Not repaid. Some debts are not repayable, but acknowledged. In the room where the music had made itself, between the man who had learned from the music and the man who had made it, there had been an evening. The evening had been enough.